Our new corporate attorney called me the morning after our annual operating agreement renewal and asked, in the careful voice lawyers use when they already know the answer is going to be bad, whether I had specifically negotiated the clause on page 40. I was standing in my kitchen in Phoenix, still holding a mug of coffee I had not taken a sip from, and I remember looking out at the grapefruit tree in my backyard like the answer might be written somewhere between the branches. My name is Cassandra Bellweather. Page 40, she said, granted my business partner unilateral authority to remove me as CEO with a simple majority vote of our outside investors. It was a provision I had never discussed, never requested, never agreed to, and apparently had signed 6 months earlier inside a 91-page document I trusted my business partner to have reviewed as carefully as I trusted her with everything else about the company we built together. I am 37 years old, and my business partner, Theodora Okonkwo, and I co-founded Bellweather Okonkwo Logistics 8 years ago. We started with 2 laptops in a shared apartment, 1 folding table we bought used, and enough confidence to mistake exhaustion for momentum. By the time that phone call came, our freight brokerage company was generating just under $9 million in annual revenue and employing 52 people across 3 regional offices in Phoenix, Arizona. Theodora handled outside investor relationships, legal coordination, financing conversations, and all the patient, detail-heavy negotiation I had never enjoyed. I ran operations, client relationships, vendor performance, hiring for the operations team, and the daily 1,000 small decisions that kept trucks moving and customers from leaving. For 8 years, that division of labor worked well enough that I signed documents she brought me with a level of trust I had never thought to question. That morning, our new attorney, Elaine Porter, did not accuse anyone of anything. She said, "Cassandra, I am not assuming bad faith, but this is not a routine provision. I need to know whether you intended it to be there." I asked her to read it again, slowly. She did. The language was dry and tidy, the kind of language designed to sound ordinary even while it changes the balance of power in a company. It said the chief executive officer could be removed by a simple majority of outside investor interests, upon motion by either founding partner, without requiring unanimous founder consent. In plain English, if Theodora could persuade enough outside investors, she could have me removed from the CEO position of the company that carried my name. I told Elaine I had not negotiated it. Then I sat down because my knees had gone light in a way I had not experienced since the early years of the company, when a late payment from one major client could mean payroll panic by Friday. Elaine asked whether I wanted her to set up a meeting with Theodora immediately. Every emotional part of me wanted to drive to the office, close Theodora's door, put the document on her desk, and ask her what exactly she thought she was doing. But I did not do that, and I want to explain why, because that single decision may be the only reason I still own my company today. At that moment, I did not know whether the clause was a deliberate trap or a drafting mistake that had slipped past everyone during a rushed renewal process. I did know that if it was deliberate, confronting Theodora before I understood the full picture would give her a chance to activate whatever plan the clause was designed to enable. I had spent years negotiating with angry clients and unreliable carriers. I understood one basic rule: when you suspect someone has hidden leverage, do not let them know you have found it until you know what the leverage is attached to. So I thanked Elaine, asked her not to mention the conversation to anyone else inside the company, and told her I would follow up by the end of the day. Then I sat in my kitchen for another 10 minutes, reading page 40 on my laptop until the words started to blur. Theodora and I had built Bellweather Okonkwo Logistics from nothing. I had slept on the floor of our first office more than once during our second year because going home for 4 hours felt less efficient than staying near the phones. I had trusted Theodora with investor calls, bank meetings, attorney relationships, and board materials because I believed her strengths covered my weaknesses and mine covered hers. That was the bargain. That was the whole point of partnership. By noon, I had called an independent attorney, separate from Elaine and separate from the corporate counsel who had prepared the renewal. Her name was Priscilla Nakamura, and she specialized in shareholder and partnership disputes. A client of ours had once described her as someone who could make a liar regret learning to read, which was exactly the kind of lawyer I suddenly needed. I met her the next afternoon in a conference room far from our offices, carrying a folder that contained the operating agreement, the founding partnership agreement, investor consent materials, and every email I could find about the renewal. Priscilla listened without interrupting. When I finished, she tapped page 40 with one finger and said, "Do not confront your partner yet. If this is innocent, we will find that out. If it is not, silence is your friend for now. I asked her what she needed. She said, everything. Every draft. Every redline. Every email. Every calendar invite. Every message about legal review. And I want the billing records from the firm that handled the renewal. That was the first time I felt something other than shock. It was not relief exactly, but it was movement. There was a path, and Priscilla knew how to walk it. For the next 3 weeks, I lived 2 lives. In one, I was the CEO everyone knew. I visited the warehouse team, handled client escalations, reviewed pricing changes, checked in with our Tucson office, and made sure our people did not feel any disruption. In the other life, I was quietly gathering the history of a document I had already signed. I forwarded emails late at night. I searched old folders for attachments with names like operating agreement, renewal final, final revised, final clean, and final final. I learned very quickly that people who name documents final are usually lying to themselves. Priscilla's review showed that the removal clause had not existed in the first 4 drafts of the renewal. Those earlier versions updated investor notice provisions, clarified distribution procedures, and adjusted a few governance timelines. Boring, normal things. The clause appeared only in a 5th version, after Theodora had personally requested revisions from our previous corporate counsel. That firm, which Theodora had selected 3 years earlier, incorporated the language without flagging it as unusual, without identifying it in a summary of material changes, and without requiring my separate sign-off. Priscilla called that, charitably, a serious professional lapse. Then she leaned back in her chair and said, less charitably, Cassandra, this is exactly what someone would engineer if she wanted a major change to pass unnoticed. I still remember the physical sensation of hearing that. My body went cold first, then hot. I was embarrassed before I was angry, which surprised me. I kept thinking, I signed it. I actually signed it. I had read parts of that renewal. I had reviewed the sections I thought mattered to operations and distributions. I had asked Theodora whether there were any governance changes I needed to focus on, and she had said, nothing material. Legal cleanup and investor language mostly. I could hear her voice saying it, casual and warm, from the doorway of my office. Priscilla did not let me sit in that shame for long. She said, you are allowed to trust a fiduciary. The issue is not that you failed to expect betrayal. The issue is whether she exploited that trust. Then she asked permission to dig into the previous law firm's relationship with Theodora. I gave it immediately. What she found explained why the drafting failure had been so convenient. The firm had represented Theodora personally, in an unrelated business matter, for nearly 2 years before they were brought on to handle our company's legal work. That relationship had never been disclosed to me. It had never been discussed when Theodora recommended switching firms. She had presented them as responsive, reasonably priced, and familiar with logistics clients. Not once had she said, they have represented me personally. Priscilla explained that the prior relationship did not automatically prove misconduct, but it was a conflict that should have been disclosed and evaluated by both founders. At minimum, I should have known that the lawyer supposedly serving our company had a pre-existing relationship with my partner. When Priscilla told me that, I stopped trying to preserve the possibility that this was all a misunderstanding. I did not say it out loud yet, but something inside me moved from disbelief to strategy. Theodora had chosen the law firm. Theodora had requested the 5th draft revisions. The clause had appeared after that. The firm had not flagged it. The firm had previously represented her personally. I could no longer pretend those facts were just sitting near one another by accident. The next question was motive. Why would Theodora want the ability to remove me as CEO? We had disagreements, of course. Any 2 founders who make it past year 3 have disagreements. She wanted faster expansion into California. I wanted to strengthen margins in Arizona and Nevada before opening another office. She liked outside capital more than I did. I preferred slower growth funded by retained earnings. But none of that explained a hidden clause. A hidden clause meant she expected a fight big enough that she needed a weapon ready before the fight began. Priscilla brought in a forensic accountant named Cornelius Akibi. He was quiet, methodical, and so precise in his questions that I found myself answering more carefully than I meant to. He asked for investor communications, board packages, financial models, personal reimbursement records, advisory agreements, acquisition inquiries, and any correspondence with companies that had expressed interest in buying us. I told him we were not for sale. He looked at me for half a second and said, that may be your position. I need to know whether it was hers. Cornelius found the motive in about 3 weeks. Theodora had been in ongoing undisclosed talks with a much larger national logistics conglomerate about an acquisition of Bellweather Okonkwo Logistics. The talks had progressed far enough that a preliminary term sheet existed. I had never seen it. I had never been told about it. The term sheet valued the company at a price that looked impressive if you only glanced at the total number, but based on our recent growth trajectory, our client retention, and 2 new regional contracts that had not yet fully hit revenue, it undersold what we were worth. Cornelius built a comparison model showing that the proposed deal would have paid out nearly 40% less per partner than a valuation based on our actual performance and market comps. I stared at that model in Priscilla's office, feeling something sharper than anger settle into my chest. I had turned down acquisition conversations before, not because I was sentimental, but because I understood our numbers. We were not a distressed company. We were not stagnant. We were not burning cash. We had difficult months, and logistics is never gentle, but we were growing in a way that made patience valuable. Selling at that moment would have rewarded impatience, not strategy. Then Cornelius showed me the second document. It was not part of the official term sheet. It was a side arrangement described in language that tried very hard not to look like what it was. The acquiring company had agreed in principle to pay Theodora a substantial personal advisory fee if the transaction closed. The fee was separate from her standard partnership proceeds. It had never been disclosed to me, even though our founding partnership agreement explicitly required either partner to disclose any personal financial benefit tied to a corporate transaction. I read the number twice. Then I asked, would that have come out of the purchase price? Cornelius said, indirectly, yes. Even if they account for it separately, it affects what they are willing to pay overall. Priscilla added, and more importantly, it gave her a personal incentive to close a deal you had not approved. That was the moment the entire shape of the thing became clear. Theodora was not simply preparing for a disagreement, she was building a legal mechanism to remove me as an obstacle if I refused to support a sale. The buried clause was not random, it was a key. I went home that night and sat on the floor of my bedroom with the original founding partnership agreement spread open in front of me. Theodora and I had signed it in our shared apartment 8 years earlier, sitting cross-legged on cheap carpet, eating takeout noodles from cartons because we could not afford proper office furniture, but somehow believed we could build a freight brokerage company. There was a picture from that night somewhere, both of us laughing, both of us exhausted, both of us certain we were on the same side. I thought about calling her. I thought about asking, when did you decide I was in your way instead of beside you? But I did not call. Priscilla had already warned me what could happen if Theodora sensed we were building a case. The practical stakes were brutal. Theodora still controlled enough outside investor relationships to potentially activate the removal clause quickly if she knew I had discovered it. She had spent years cultivating those investors. She knew their concerns, their pressure points, their appetite for liquidity. If she presented the acquisition as a limited-time opportunity and framed me as emotionally attached or too conservative, she might be able to persuade a simple majority to remove me before I could stop her. Even if I eventually won in court, the company could be sold, leadership could change, employees could scatter, and clients could lose confidence. The damage would not wait politely for litigation to finish. So Priscilla moved fast. She prepared an emergency request for a temporary restraining order and preliminary injunction. The filing argued that the removal clause had been inserted through a conflicted legal process, without proper disclosure to me as an equal founding partner, and that Theodora had breached her fiduciary duties by concealing both the acquisition negotiations and the personal advisory fee tied to the proposed sale. Cornelius organized the evidence into exhibits: the draft history, the fifth revision request, the prior counsel conflict, the term sheet, the advisory fee communications, investor emails, calendar entries, and financial analysis showing the proposed valuation was materially below fair value. During those days, I barely slept. I would wake at 3 o'clock in the morning and remember some old email Theodora had sent that suddenly seemed suspicious. I searched my inbox from bed. I reread board notes. I replayed conversations in my head. Had she hinted at this during our quarterly planning meeting? Had I missed her testing investor appetite during that dinner in Scottsdale? Had I mistaken secrecy for busyness? The worst part was not knowing where the betrayal began. Once trust cracks, it sends cracks backward through memory. Moments that had seemed ordinary started looking staged. At the office, Theodora acted normal. That was its own kind of pressure. She would appear in my doorway with a question about receivables, or send me a message about a client renewal, or laugh with Marisol Vance, our operations director, near the dispatch monitors. I studied her face more than I wanted to. Sometimes I thought I saw strain, sometimes I thought I saw nothing at all. I wondered if she was watching me too, trying to determine whether I knew. Our conversations became careful performances, each of us possibly hiding something from the other. The difference was that I was trying to protect the company from a hidden plan. She was the hidden plan. Priscilla filed the emergency request on a Tuesday morning. By Thursday afternoon, the court granted a temporary order preventing Theodora from exercising the removal clause, taking action to remove me as CEO, advancing the acquisition talks, or soliciting investor consent connected to the proposed sale until a fuller hearing could be held. The order did not decide the entire case, but it froze the situation in place. It gave us oxygen. Theodora was served at her own office the next morning. I was there with Priscilla because there was no version of that moment. I was willing to hear about secondhand. The process server handed her the envelope, and Theodora's expression changed in stages as she read. First confusion, then irritation, then a stillness I had seen only a few times, usually across negotiating tables, when she realized someone had cornered her with a fact she could not talk around. She looked up at me and said, "What is this?" I said, "It is the thing you hoped I would not find." Priscilla kept her voice even. The order prevents any use of the page 40 removal provision and any further acquisition activity pending the hearing. You should direct questions to your attorney. Theodora's eyes moved from Priscilla to me, and for a second I saw the woman I had known for 8 years, the one who used to celebrate every new client by buying cheap cupcakes from the grocery store because it was all we could afford. Then that woman disappeared behind calculation. She said, that clause was standard governance language. Counsel recommended it for operational flexibility. You are overreacting because you do not like being challenged. Priscilla opened her folder. The clause was not present in drafts 1 through 4. It appears after your requested revisions to draft 5. The firm that inserted it previously represented you personally, a conflict not disclosed to Miss Bellweather. You also failed to disclose acquisition negotiations and a personal advisory fee from the proposed buyer. Theodora's mouth tightened at the word fee. That was when I knew, with a certainty that made my stomach turn, that every major allegation was true. For a few minutes she denied pieces of it. She said the acquisition talks were exploratory. She said the advisory fee was not final. She said I had always been reluctant to consider strategic options. She said outside investors deserved liquidity. She said the company needed leadership willing to move at market speed. Priscilla let her talk. Then she placed the documents on the conference table one by one. Emails, draft comparisons, calendar entries, the side fee language, the valuation analysis. The more paper appeared, the smaller Theodora's explanations became. Finally, Theodora sat down. She looked at me, not at Priscilla, and said, "You were going to block it." I asked, "Block what? A sale I did not know existed?" She said, "You would have blocked it the second I brought it to you. You always do this. You call it discipline, but it is fear. We had a chance to cash out near the top of the market, and you would have dragged us into another 3 years of risk because you cannot let go." I remember how calm I sounded when I answered, because inside I was shaking. "So you hid a clause that would let you remove me from my own company." She said, "I protected the company's future." That sentence has stayed with me more than any insult would have. It would almost have been easier if she had said, "I wanted the money." At least that would have been clean. Instead, she had built herself a story where betraying me was responsible leadership. In her mind, I was not a co-founder with equal rights. I was an obstacle she had patiently decided to manage. The advisory fee, the hidden clause, the conflicted law firm, the secret term sheet, all of it had been filed under necessity. I asked her one question. When were you going to tell me? She did not answer. That was the answer. The hearing process that followed was not dramatic in the way people imagine legal fights are dramatic. It was paperwork, affidavits, attorney letters, negotiated deadlines, document productions, and expensive hours spent reconstructing conversations everyone suddenly claimed to remember differently. The temporary order stayed in place while Priscilla pursued breach of fiduciary duty claims. The previous law firm's role became a separate pressure point, because their failure to disclose the conflict and flag the governance change looked worse with every email Priscilla obtained. The outside investors, once they understood the undisclosed advisory fee, became much less eager to treat the proposed acquisition as a clean business opportunity. Nobody likes discovering they were being guided toward a transaction by someone with a side payment in her pocket. Running the company during that period was the hardest professional thing I have ever done. Every morning, trucks still had to move. Clients still expected updates. Employees still needed decisions. Payroll still mattered. Freight does not pause because two founders are in a legal war. I would spend the day solving operational problems and the evening reviewing legal strategy. I learned to take calls from Priscilla in my car because I did not want anyone in the office overhearing. I learned to keep my face neutral when Theodora's name came up in meetings. I learned that adrenaline can keep a person moving for a while, but not forever. Our employees never learned the full legal details while it was happening. I made that choice deliberately. There were 52 people whose livelihoods did not need to become spectators to founder litigation. I told the leadership team only that Theodora and I were working through a governance dispute and that operations would continue under my authority pursuant to a court order. That was enough to be honest without dumping legal poison into the company bloodstream. Marisol Vance, our operations director, watched me closely during that time. She had been with us since year 2 and knew me well enough to know when I was editing myself. One evening, after most of the office had emptied, Marisol stepped into my doorway and said, "Is this about those meetings Theodora kept taking off calendar?" I looked up too quickly. "What meetings?" Marisol hesitated, then said, "I do not know. I just noticed she started blocking travel days differently last year." More private calls, more last-minute investor lunches. I figured it was financing stuff. She folded her arms, uncomfortable. I did not think it was worth mentioning. I told her she had done nothing wrong, and she had not. Theodora's secrecy had been designed to look like ordinary executive work, but Marisol's observation fit the acquisition timeline exactly. The hidden conversations had not been a few casual inquiries. They had been a sustained campaign. About 4 months into the dispute, Theodora's attorney approached Priscilla about settlement. The first proposal was insulting. Theodora wanted to keep her ownership stake, step back from management, and receive certain protections if a future sale occurred. Priscilla read it, made one short note in the margin, and said, "No." The second proposal was better, but still assumed we could remain business partners on paper. I told Priscilla there was no path back to that. Trust is not a line item you can restate after fraud. I could negotiate price, transition, non-disparagement, and confidentiality. I could not negotiate myself into staying legally tied to someone who had tried to remove me with a clause she hid in the document pile. The turning point came when Theodora's own attorney saw the full evidence around the advisory fee and the prior counsel conflict. Priscilla later told me carefully that his tone changed after that production. Before, he had argued about interpretation. After, he argued about resolution. There is a difference. Interpretation means someone still thinks they can win. Resolution means they are calculating how bad losing would look. Roughly 7 months after the confrontation in Theodora's office, the breach of fiduciary duty case settled. Theodora agreed to sell her half of Bellweather Okonkwo Logistics to me at a valuation determined by an independent court-appointed appraiser. That mattered. She had tried to push a sale based on a term sheet that undervalued us. I was not going to let her exit based on that same distorted number, and I was not going to let myself overpay just to end the pain faster. The appraiser reviewed our financials, growth trajectory, client contracts, market comps, and risk profile. When the final valuation came in, it was nearly 40% higher than what the conglomerate's proposed deal would have paid out per partner. I cried when Priscilla called me with the number. Not because I was suddenly happy. I was too tired for happiness. I cried because the number confirmed I had not been stubborn for nothing. My instinct that the proposed sale undervalued us had been right. Theodora had nearly forced me out to close a deal that served her personal timeline and personal fee more than it served the company. For months, she had treated my caution like weakness. The valuation made clear it had been judgment. The buyout closing was quiet. Theodora and I signed documents in separate rooms. I did not see her that day. Part of me wanted a final conversation, some last exchange that would make the ending feel less hollow. But life rarely arranges betrayal into satisfying dialogue. The papers moved from room to room. Attorneys checked signatures. Funds transferred. Ownership changed. By late afternoon, Bellweather Okonkwo Logistics was mine. Within a month, I renamed the company Bellweather Logistics. I did not do it out of spite, though I would be lying if I said there was no emotion in removing her name from the door. Mostly, the old name had become inaccurate. It represented a partnership that no longer existed, and I needed employees, clients, and investors to understand that the company still had continuity, but not confusion. We updated signage, letterhead, email signatures, customer portals, and carrier documents. The first morning I walked into the Phoenix office and saw Bellweather Logistics on the wall. I stood there longer than I meant to. It felt less like victory than survival. I also hired new outside counsel with no prior relationship to me, to Theodora, or to any investor. Then I implemented a policy that now applies to every material governance document, financing document, acquisition inquiry, major investor consent, and operating agreement amendment. Independent review by separate counsel, written summary of material changes, tracked redlines preserved in a central archive, and a signed acknowledgement from the responsible executives that they have personally reviewed every change. When we had only one founder after the buyout, the policy still required outside review by counsel, whose engagement letter made clear who they represented and what conflicts existed. It sounds obvious now, painfully obvious. But before page 40, I had treated legal review as a shared administrative function. I had believed that because Theodora and I were building the same company, we were automatically protected by the same advice. Priscilla corrected me on that. She said, "A company lawyer represents the company. A partnership lawyer may serve the entity. But when founders' interests diverge, no single lawyer magically represents everyone's personal risk equally." She also told me that partnership disputes involving buried governance clauses were more common than people outside corporate law tend to assume. Founders rarely imagine needing separate legal representation during routine renewals. They treat trust as a control system. But trust is not a control system. Trust is a relationship. Controls exist for the day the relationship is under stress. Cornelius said something similar from the financial side. He told me the undisclosed advisory fee was, in his experience, one of the most common threads in partner-driven acquisition schemes. A personal payout tied to closing can turn an otherwise rational founder into someone who sincerely believes the deal must happen. The fee becomes proof of importance. The buyer's attention becomes validation. The partner starts seeing objections as threats instead of governance. "People are very good at mistaking their incentive for the company's destiny," he said. I wrote that down and kept it. The 8 months between Elaine's first phone call and the final buyout closing changed how I run Bellweather Logistics. I still trust people, but I no longer confuse trust with skipping verification. I read every governing document personally before signing, every page, every schedule, every exhibit. I ask questions that feel awkward. I make lawyers explain provisions in plain English. If someone says, "That is standard," I say, "Standard for whom, and standard in whose interest?" It costs time. Sometimes it slows things down. But compared with the 8 months it took to undo the one time I did not read closely enough, an extra hour with a document is cheap. The company has grown considerably in the 3 years since the buyout. We expanded carefully, not slowly. There is a difference. We added a stronger carrier compliance team, opened a small office in New Mexico, and improved our contract pricing system so we could protect margins without surprising clients. Some of the outside investors who had once been receptive to Theodora's acquisition pitch eventually admitted they had liked the idea of liquidity, but had not understood the full picture. I did not punish them for that. Investors often see companies through numbers first. My job was to make sure the numbers were honest and the governance was clean. As for Theodora, I do not know much about her life now, and I prefer it that way. The settlement included confidentiality and non-disparagement provisions, so there are details I still do not discuss publicly. But the broad truth is simple enough. She tried to use a buried clause, a conflicted legal process, and an undisclosed personal financial incentive to force a sale and remove me if I resisted. She was held accountable by the court process, by the evidence, and ultimately by having to sell her stake at a fair independent valuation, instead of steering the company into the undervalued deal she had arranged behind my back. I still keep the original 91-page operating agreement. Page 40 is dog-eared now. It sits in a drawer beside the founding partnership agreement. Theodora and I signed in that shared apartment when there was less money at stake and much more trust between us. I take it out occasionally, not because I enjoy reliving what happened, but because I never want success to make me careless again. The dangerous clause did not announce itself. It did not look dramatic. It hid inside dense language surrounded by 90 pages of routine provisions, relying on the oldest shortcut in business, the assumption that someone you trust has already checked. During onboarding, new managers sometimes ask why our documentation review process is so strict. They ask why legal summaries have to identify every material change, why redlines are archived, why no one is allowed to circulate signature pages without the final document attached, why I insist that executives read documents instead of just approving them through workflow software. I tell them the short version. A single buried clause on page 40 once came within weeks of costing me the company I built. The extra hour it takes to read every page is cheaper than the legal fees, lost sleep, and 8 months of pressure it took to undo the one time I did not. And if there is one thing I wish I could tell my younger self, sitting on the carpet with Theodora and those takeout cartons, it would not be to distrust everyone. That would be too easy and too bitter. I would tell her to build protections while the relationship is still good, because that is when people can agree to them without feeling accused. Separate counsel is not an insult. Clear disclosure rules are not paranoia. Redlines are not bureaucracy. They are the guardrails that keep ambition from rewriting loyalty when money gets large enough to make people creative with their conscience. So that is my story. My business partner buried a clause on page 40 that could have pushed me out of my own company, and the only reason it failed was because one careful attorney asked an uncomfortable question before assuming the document was routine. What would you have done if you discovered your partner had been quietly building a way to remove you? Would you have confronted her immediately, or stayed silent long enough to gather proof? Share this with someone who signs documents on trust, because sometimes the most expensive sentence in the room is the one nobody reads. Thank you for listening, and subscribe for more true-to-life stories about trust, betrayal, and the hard lessons people learn when business and loyalty collide. Take care of yourself and read page 40.